Remember all that fear around open source software and torrenting? Back in the day, it felt so risky, even dangerous. And now, everywhere,
It
right?
really is.
It's like we see this pattern with disruptive tech. They clash with the mainstream, then kind of just become the norm.
Yeah.
That's what this deep dive is about.
Yeah, interesting.
Web3, is it on that same path?
It's wild, huh? How often resistance to new tech comes from, like, fear of the unknown or wanting things to just stay the same.
Yeah.
But you're right. History shows us that innovation usually finds a way, even in, like, the most surprising ways.
Exactly. And that's where our deep dive book comes in. The Age of Decentralization, How Web3 and Related Technologies Will Change Industries and Our Lives,
Oh,
by Sam Ghosh and Sopisas Garai, published in 2025.
2025. Interesting. Given all that's happening with Web3 right now, we're in this crypto winter, less investment, more regulations.
Right.
It's feeling, I don't know, kind of bleak.
Yeah. Before we get into all that, quick word on the authors, right? So Sam Ghosh is an engineer, got an MBA, even completed the CFA program.
Wow.
He's a fintech entrepreneur and, get this, has taught Web3 to thousands of people globally.
Okay.
Sopisas Garai, total tech veteran, almost 2 decades of experience at companies like Caldera, Microsoft, Intuit, even Yahoo.
Impressive.
Has a master's in software systems.
Wow. These guys definitely have the credentials for this. They've seen how tech evolves, how tough it is to bring these new ideas into the mainstream.
Absolutely. So today we're giving you a high-level overview of this book, hitting the major points of each section, and then we're going to really dig into the introduction. Think of it as a sneak peek into the minds of these Web3 experts, and we want you to walk away with a solid understanding of this book.
Yeah, and hopefully you can start to see how they connect the dots between historical disruptions and what might be in store for Web3.
Exactly. And like those examples of open source and torrenting going from like fringe to familiar, the authors think Web3 is about to go through something similar. They start by reminding us just how much pushback those earlier technologies got.
Right, like open source, people thought, it was amateur, unreliable. Why use free software when you can pay for the good stuff,
Yeah.
right? But then you had that SEO versus IBM lawsuit. SEO tried to claim that Linux, which was like the open source operating system, was using their proprietary UNI Xcode.
Oh, that was huge.
Yeah.
Threatened the whole open source movement.
Yeah, right.
And then you had Microsoft with their Get the Facts campaign, trying to make open source look bad, especially Linux. Less secure, less reliable.
Oh, yeah.
Stick with our stuff.
Right. But even with all that pushback, open source won out. I mean, think about it. Linux powers most of the world's supercomputers, smartphones, a huge chunk of the top websites globally.
Yeah, and the biggest plot twist.
What's that?
Microsoft embraced open source, started integrating Linux functionalities into their own ecosystem. Talk about a change of heart.
That's amazing. Really shows that even with powerful opposition, if a technology brings real value, meets people's needs, it can overcome those early obstacles and become, like, widely adopted.
Right. Now, torrenting was a whole other battle, right? Big issue there was copyright infringement. Sites like the Pirate Bay became notorious for, sharing copyrighted stuff.
Yeah.
Lawmakers were scrambling to shut it down. Remember SOPA and PAPA?
Yes. The Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect IP Act. Huge uproar over those bills. They wanted to give authorities the power to block any website accused of helping with, copyright infringement.
People were worried about censorship, what it would do to internet freedom. Massive public outcry. Ultimately, both bills were shelved.
It really shows you that the success of a technology isn't just about its technical capabilities, right? It's also about whether people accept it, if it aligns with society's values. That plays a huge role in whether it becomes mainstream or fades away.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. The tech behind torrenting, that decentralized peer-to-peer model, too valuable to disappear. Lots of companies figured out how to use the good parts of torrenting for legitimate reasons.
Makes sense.
Right. You see elements of torrenting in content delivery networks, what major streaming platforms use, even software updates for games like World of Warcraft use peer-to-peer distribution, taking inspiration from torrent tech.
Wow.
So both open source and torrenting, despite facing huge hurdles, ended up influencing the tech landscape in big ways. And that brings us back to the book's core question.
Yeah.
Can Web3 follow a similar path?
And here's where it gets really interesting. The authors don't just speculate. They actually lay out a practical framework for how Web3 could be integrated into existing tech systems through something they call a decentralization layer.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What is this decentralization layer? How does it bridge the gap between, traditional tech and Web3.
Well, they argue that instead of trying to replace everything we have, we can add a Web3 layer that uses smart contracts. Think of it as injecting a dose of decentralization into what we already use.
I like that. Not a complete overhaul, just a strategic upgrade.
Exactly. And one of the biggest benefits they point to is immutability. Once something's recorded on a blockchain, it can't be changed. This could be huge for things like supply chains, where tracking where things come from, knowing they're authentic, is super important.
That makes a lot of sense, especially with, people wanting more transparency, more accountability these days. It's
Sure.
like a built-in trust system.
Exactly. And it's not just immutability. This decentralization layer could also mean more transparency overall because anyone can audit the transactions on the blockchain. Plus, there's potential for automation through smart contracts, cutting out middlemen, streamlining processes.
So they're not just talking about cryptocurrencies or NFTs, but a fundamental shift in how we design and interact with technology, creating systems that are more resilient, transparent, more user-centric.
Right. And here's a key distinction they make. The book focuses primarily on technical decentralization,
Right.
not necessarily governance decentralization.
Okay, so they're not saying every platform needs to be run as a DAO, for instance. They're focused on how the technical benefits of decentralization can improve existing systems, no matter how they're governed. Okay, so we've got this idea of Web3 following in the footsteps of open source and torrenting and this concept of a decentralization layer. But let's face it, things aren't looking so hot for Web3 right now. We've got this crypto winter, all this regulatory uncertainty looming over everything.
They do acknowledge that, but they argue that based on what happened with open source and torrenting, this resistance is actually a natural part of the process. It might even be necessary for Web3 to mature and become truly mainstream.
Interesting. So instead of seeing these challenges as a sign of failure, they see them as growing
It's
pains.
exactly. It's like anything new. There's hype, then disillusionment, and then eventually things stabilize and become productive.
Okay, so we've gotten a taste of the book's argument, its historical context. Now let's zoom in on the different sections. I'm curious to see how they break things down.
Sure, after laying the groundwork, they have a whole chapter called Primer on Web3 and Distributed Systems. It's where they get into the nitty-gritty of what Web3 is all about. They explain terms like blockchain, smart contracts, tokens, stuff that can sound really intimidating to people. They also cover specific technologies like Ethereum and the Ethereum virtual machine. Like, they're demystifying the jargon surrounding Web3.
That's so important. Those terms can be a real barrier to entry, make Web3 seem overly technical.
Right. Then they get into specific areas where they see huge potential for Web3 to disrupt existing models. They have chapters dedicated to decentralized identity systems, decentralized storage.
Those are definitely hot topics.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear what they have to say about decentralized identity systems. It feels like we've all become so vulnerable with our data spread across all these different platforms.
Yeah, me too. And decentralized storage is fascinating too, really challenging those giant cloud providers we all rely on.
Yeah. They also have a chapter dedicated to decentralized data science, which seems super relevant with all the talk about AI these days.
Right. They discuss things like federated learning, where machine learning models are trained on data that stays in its original location. Could be revolutionary for industries like healthcare, where data privacy is paramount.
Wow. So they're really painting a picture of how Web3 could impact like all these different areas of our lives.
They are. Then they go deeper into the concept of decentralization itself. In a chapter literally titled Decentralization in Web3, they break down the different types of decentralization and how they apply specifically to Web3 platforms. They also discuss how these platforms are governed, even touch on the debates about Section 230.
It's great that they're looking at the legal and social implications too, not just the tech side of things.
Absolutely.
Well,
And then they have a chapter called Decentralization with Token or Without Tokens, where they explore the different ways tokens are used in Web3, whether we could even move beyond tokens in the future.
wow, that's a bold question. Feels like tokens have become synonymous with Web3, so it's interesting they're challenging that idea.
Yeah.
So they're not afraid to ask tough questions and explore different possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. They even dive into the technical details of building Web3 systems in a chapter on Web3 architectures. They encourage a shift from thinking about platforms to thinking about networks, which I think is a really important distinction.
Yeah, it sounds like they're advocating for a more interconnected, collaborative approach to building the future of technology.
They are. And finally, they bring it all together in a chapter called Decentralization of Traditional Architectures with Decentralization Layers. This is where they get really practical, showing how this decentralization layer could be implemented in different industries. They even talk about regulatory considerations, the economics of making it happen.
So they're not just pie-in-the-sky theorizing. They're offering real-world solutions.
Exactly. And to top it off, they have a chapter with real-world case studies showing how this decentralization layer could change things in gaming, media distribution, social media.
It's always helpful to see those concrete examples.
Right. And in their epilogue, decentralization as a separate industry, they envision decentralization becoming a core part of the tech landscape. They talk about things like decentralization as a service, where you could essentially access everything you need to build decentralized systems.
So they see decentralization as more than just a set of technologies. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about and build the digital world.
Exactly. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here in terms of what this book is about and its structure, but let's zoom back in on that introduction chapter. What are some of the key takeaways there?
Well, they start by really laying out why they believe decentralization is so important right now. They talk about the rise of large centralized architectures and how this concentration of power has led to so many problems.
We've all seen it, data breaches, privacy violations, the growing influence of big tech companies. It's like they're tapping into this growing feeling that the current model, with so much power in the hands of a few, just isn't sustainable.
Right. They specifically mention things like the Equifax data breach, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, even that massive Yahoo hack that affected all 3 billion of their user accounts.
Oh, wow.
These are just a few examples of how vulnerable centralized systems can be.
Right. And it's not just about security. They also talk about the economic costs of centralization. They point out that these big platforms, they often make tons of money off users and creators, but end up concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a very small number of people.
It's like they're raising this question. Is there a fairer way to do things? A way where more people benefit from this digital revelation?
Exactly. And they dive into the whole debate about Section 230, which has become so controversial. They argue that Web3 technologies could offer a different way to moderate content, govern platforms, maybe even address some of the concerns people have about Section 230.
That's a pretty big claim. It shows they're thinking about these big picture issues and how Web3 could actually influence the way the internet evolves.
Yeah.
But they don't just focus on the problems with centralization. They also talk about the rise of decentralized business models, like user-generated gaming economies, creator economy platforms.
Right.
These examples show that people want more participatory, community-driven models, where they have more ownership and control over their contributions, how they benefit from them.
Makes sense.
Right. They mention platforms like Roblox, Decentraland, Audius, even Patreon as early examples of this shift.
Yeah, those platforms are definitely doing things differently, putting users and creators in the driver's seat. So in that introduction, they paint a pretty compelling picture of why decentralization matters and how Web3 could offer some solutions to the problems we're facing with centralized systems.
They're basically saying, hey, we've got these challenges, but we also have these new technologies that could help us create a better digital future.
Exactly. Now, in part 2 of our deep dive, we're going to get into the specifics of how they envision this happening. We'll explore those chapters on decentralized identity systems, decentralized storage, and decentralized data science.
Can't wait to hear what they have to say. It sounds like we're about to get into some really mind-blowing stuff.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the age of decentralization. Last time we kind of explored the author's central argument. Web3, despite some bumps in the road, has the potential to follow a similar path as open source and torrenting, eventually becoming just a normal part of our digital lives. And we touched on their concept of a decentralization layer, which is a really intriguing idea.
It is, and I'm super curious to see how they envision this decentralization layer, like working in practice. But before we get into that, I'd love to explore those chapters on decentralized identity systems, decentralized storage, and decentralized data science. They really highlight the potential of Web3 to change how we interact with technology and data, and frankly, they sound kind of mind-blowing.
Absolutely. Let's start with decentralized identity systems. The authors see this as a huge opportunity for Web3 to shake things up and give individuals more control over their personal data. Think about it. How many times have you seen those scary headlines about data breaches, privacy violations, and the growing power of, big tech? Decentralized identity offers a potential way out by putting control back into the hands of individuals, rather than these massive corporations.
Okay, I'm all ears. What exactly is a decentralized identity system, and how does it work?
Well, the authors start by breaking down what an identity system even is, covering concepts like identity, identifiers, attestations, and roles. They emphasize that in most systems we use today, you don't actually own your identity. It's controlled by all these different institutions and companies. It's like your identity is scattered across the internet, with pieces of it held by banks, social media platforms, government agencies, you name it.
That's so true. Think about all the different logins and profiles you have for different websites and services. It's a total mess. And you have very little say in how that information is used or shared.
Exactly. And that's where decentralized identity comes in. The authors explain that it's built on this idea of self-sovereignty, meaning you should have complete control over your digital identity and how your data is used.
So instead of all those scattered pieces, you have one secure digital ID that you control. And that represents, you across the internet. That would be amazing. No more juggling dozens of accounts and passwords.
Right. And with this digital ID, you can selectively choose what information to share with different services. Imagine being able to prove you're over 18 without revealing your birth date or address, or verify your professional qualifications without giving away your entire work history.
Okay, that's pretty cool. But how do they actually make this work technically?
Well, they introduced this idea of decentralized identifiers, or DDs, which are basically unique identifiers that you control, independent of any central authority. It's like a digital fingerprint that's truly yours.
And these DDs can be linked to verifiable credentials, which are digital versions of things like driver's licenses, diplomas, professional certifications. That would be a game changer for things like job applications, age verification, super secure and efficient.
Exactly. The authors envision a future where you can instantly and securely prove your qualifications or attributes without all the hassle and paperwork we deal with today.
But beyond those examples, what are the broader implications of decentralized identity? Why should, the average person care about this?
Well, the authors argue that it could lead to greater financial inclusion, especially for people in developing countries who lack traditional forms of identification. It could also significantly reduce identity theft, since you wouldn't be relying on centralized databases that are vulnerable to hacking.
That's a huge deal. It feels like this could be a real game changer for so many people. But is this just a theoretical concept? Or are there actual, real-world examples of decentralized identity being used today?
Oh, they definitely dive into some real-world examples. They talk about Ethereum-based decentralized identity projects and highlight sign-in with Ethereum as a really promising development.
So you could log into websites using your Ethereum wallet instead of creating a new account. That would be so much easier.
Exactly. They also discuss Polygon ID, which uses zero-knowledge cryptography to make things even more private and secure. And they mention other decentralized identity solutions like Bright-Eyed, Civic, and Sovereign.
Wow, there's a lot happening in this space already. But I imagine there's still some, challenges to overcome before this becomes mainstream, right?
Oh, absolutely. The authors are honest about the limitations. They talk about usability issues because let's face it, blockchain technology isn't exactly user-friendly right now.
Hmm.
There are also scalability concerns. Can these systems handle millions, even billions of users? And they point out the need for greater interoperability between different systems.
It wouldn't be very useful if your decentralized ID only worked on a handful of websites.
Right. And then there are the regulatory hurdles. Governments are still figuring out how to deal with all of this, which can create uncertainty, slow things down.
It sounds like a lot needs to fall into place for this to really take off. But even with those challenges, the potential benefits of decentralized identity are too big to ignore. It's definitely something to watch. Okay, so we've covered decentralized identity, which is mind-blowing enough on its own. But what about decentralized storage? That feels like another area ripe for disruption, especially with those giant cloud companies seemingly controlling everything.
It is. And the authors start by giving you a really clear picture of how cloud computing works, including different cloud service models and deployment methods. But they quickly point out the downsides of relying on these centralized providers.
I'm guessing things like security breaches, vendor lock-in, and the potential for data loss or service disruptions.
Exactly. They even mentioned that Amazon S3 outage back in 2017, which took down a huge chunk of the internet for hours. And as more companies use multiple cloud providers, things are getting even more complex and potentially riskier.
So enter decentralized storage as the potential hero. How do they propose using Web3 to address these challenges?
Well, they argue that by decentralizing storage, we can create systems that are more secure, resilient, and resistant to censorship. Your data wouldn't be held in one central location, making it much harder to hack or take down.
It's like having multiple backups of your data spread across a network, instead of keeping all your eggs in one basket.
Right. And because these systems are built on blockchain technology, they offer immutability, meaning your data can't be tampered with, and increased transparency, allowing you to track exactly where your data is and who has access to it.
Okay, that sounds pretty awesome. But I'm guessing there are some hurdles here too. Blockchain technology isn't exactly known for being fast or efficient when it comes to storing large amounts of data.
That's one of the limitations they discuss. They acknowledge that blockchain technology can be slow and expensive for storing large files, especially compared to those massive data centers that cloud providers have.
So it's a trade-off between security and efficiency.
In a way, yes. But they're optimistic that these challenges can be overcome as technology evolves. They point to projects like IPFS or the Interplanetary File System, which uses a peer-to-peer network to store and share data.
I've heard of IPFS. It's like a decentralized version of the internet, right?
Exactly. And they also discuss Filecoin, which incentivizes people to contribute their storage space to a decentralized network, creating a more robust and distributed alternative to those centralized cloud giants.
So it's like creating a marketplace for storage where anyone can participate and earn rewards. That's a cool concept.
It is, but again, they're realistic about the challenges. Decentralized storage is still in its early stages, and it faces hurdles in terms of scalability, cost-effectiveness, and user adoption.
It's always a balancing act with new technologies, isn't it?
Yeah.
Weighing the potential benefits against the practical realities of making them work.
Absolutely. But even with those challenges, the possibilities are pretty exciting.
Okay, we've covered decentralized identity and storage. What about decentralized data science? That's the one that's been really capturing my imagination.
This is where things get really interesting. We're talking about merging Web3 with AI and machine learning, two of the most powerful and potentially disruptive forces in technology today. The authors start by explaining why we even need to decentralize data science in the first place. They argue that the current models, where data is often controlled by a few powerful entities, limit innovation, reinforce existing biases, and pose serious privacy risks.
It makes sense. If just a handful of companies control most of the data, they get to decide what gets built and how it gets used.
Exactly, and it's not just about limiting innovation. It can perpetuate societal biases if the data used to train AI systems is skewed or incomplete. And then there's a privacy issue. Do we really want these companies having so much access to our personal information?
Okay, so how does decentralization offer a solution here?
One of the key concepts they introduce is federated learning. Imagine training a powerful AI model without ever sharing your raw data. That's essentially what federated learning does.
Wait, how is that even possible? Don't you need all the data in one place to train these models?
Traditionally, yes. But with federated learning, the model is trained on data that stays distributed across multiple devices or servers. It's like sending the model out to the data rather than bringing the data to the model.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. So instead of me uploading all my data to Google or Facebook, the AI model comes to my phone or computer, learns from my data, and then moves on to the next device.
Exactly. And through a clever combination of techniques, the model can learn from all this decentralized data without compromising anyone's privacy or security.
That sounds amazing. What kind of real-world applications could this have?
Well, the authors are particularly excited about the potential for healthcare. Think about all the sensitive medical data that's out there. Federated learning could allow researchers to analyze this data and develop new treatments without ever accessing the raw data itself.
That could be revolutionary. We could accelerate medical breakthroughs while protecting patient privacy. It feels like this technology could be applied to any field where data privacy is crucial.
They also talk about decentralized data marketplaces, where people and organizations can securely share and monetize their data without giving up control over how it's used. Imagine a world where you could choose to share your data for research or advertising and actually get paid for it, instead of having it exploited without your knowledge or consent.
It's like a fairer, more transparent model for the data economy, where individuals have more power.
Exactly. And they go even further, discussing advanced techniques like differential privacy and homomorphic encryption, which allow data to be analyzed and used without revealing any sensitive information.
It's like magic. You can get insights from the data without actually seeing the data itself.
Pretty much. And they also touch on edge computing and edge analytics, which bring computation and data analysis closer to where the data is generated.
So instead of sending all your data to the cloud, the processing happens on your phone or device.
Right. This can improve efficiency, reduce latency, and enhance privacy, because the data doesn't need to travel as far. They even talk about secure multi-party computation, which allows multiple parties to work with data without revealing their individual inputs to each other.
Okay, my brain is starting to melt a little bit with all this advanced tech, but I'm getting the sense that decentralized data science has the potential to change pretty much everything.
It really does. It's about creating systems that are more private, more secure, and more equitable, where individuals have more control over their data and how it's used.
This is definitely a lot to digest,
Yeah.
but I'm excited to see how this all plays out.
Me too. And there's even more to come. In part 3 of our deep dive, we'll explore those chapters on Web3 governance, the role of tokens, and the author's vision for decentralization as a separate industry.
Stay tuned, we're just getting started.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the age of decentralization.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From the history of disruptive tech to those mind-blowing chapters on decentralized identity, storage, and data science.
It's been quite a journey.
Now, we're going to tackle one of the most, I think, important and often debated aspects of Web3,
Oh, okay.
governance.
Yeah, this is where it gets real, right? We can
Yeah.
talk about all the cool technology and potential benefits, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to who's in control. How are those decisions made?
Exactly. And the authors, they dive right into this in a chapter literally titled Decentralization in Web3. They start by kind of breaking down the difference between, centralized versus decentralized systems,
Yeah.
explaining how control is distributed or not in each model. They highlight the advantages of decentralization, things like resilience, transparency, that resistance to censorship. But they also acknowledge the potential downsides. Because let's be real, there are always trade-offs.
Of course.
And then they give you a really clear definition of decentralization itself, breaking it down into different types: architectural, political, and logical. This helps clarify what we're even talking about when we use this word decentralization.
Makes sense. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot.
It does, and they make this really important point about governance decentralization. They say that even a system that's technically decentralized, like, a blockchain, could still be governed in a centralized way.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It reminds us we need to think about both the technical and the social dimensions of this, right? It's not just about the code, but who has the power to change that code, to actually make decisions.
Exactly, and they bring up the whole debate surrounding Section 230,
Mhm.
which has become, a hot button issue these days,
Mm.
especially when it comes to content moderation and the role of online platforms.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a controversial topic.
It's interesting how they tie in those legal and regulatory frameworks, because those things are absolutely going to shape how Web3 develops and whether it actually gets adopted.
For sure.
They argue that Web3 technologies could offer a different approach to content moderation and governance, maybe even address some of those concerns people have about Section 230. And they even give us this framework for evaluating governance systems, outlining principles like transparency, fairness, equity, protection of minority rights, and accountability.
Wow, that's really comprehensive. It's like they're laying out a blueprint for building a more just and equitable digital society, which is something I think a lot of people are really craving right now.
Totally. Then they get into the concept of decentralized governance in Web3, specifically focusing on DAOs and token-based governance. I've heard so much buzz about DAOs lately. Can you just give me like a simple explanation of what they are and why people are so excited about them?
So think of a DAO as basically an organization that's run by code and community voting.
Okay.
Instead of having, a CEO or a board of directors calling the shots, decisions are made collectively by the people who actually hold tokens in that DAO.
So like a more democratic way of running an organization.
Exactly. And it's a radical departure from those traditional hierarchical structures we're so used to, right?
Right.
DAOs offer this potential for more participatory governance, where everyone has a voice, a stake in the outcome.
Sounds like a really powerful concept, but I'm guessing it's not without its challenges. How do you prevent, things like manipulation or ensure that everyone's voice is actually heard?
Right. They acknowledge those challenges. One of the biggest is making sure those governance mechanisms are truly representative and inclusive.
Mhm.
They also talk about the potential for large token holders to have too much sway over decisions.
It's like any system. You have to be mindful of who has the power and how they might use it.
Absolutely. And they give some real-world examples of DAOs in action, including projects like Curve and Uniswap, which are already making waves in the DeFi space, so they don't shy away from the complexities of actually making decentralized governance work in practice.
Okay, so we've talked about governance. What about tokens? It feels like they're inseparable from this whole Web3 conversation.
They definitely are, and they dedicate a whole chapter to this question, decentralization with token or without tokens. They explore the different roles tokens play in these Web3 platforms from, incentivizing participation to facilitating governance to representing ownership.
Right. I'm starting to see how tokens can act as these building blocks for all sorts of new economic models, new ways of interacting online.
Absolutely. But they also point out some of the potential issues with tokens, like speculation and volatility. We've all seen how wildly the price of cryptocurrencies can fluctuate, right?
Yeah.
Which can create instability and make it really tough for businesses to operate. They also raise concerns about power dynamics. If a small number of people hold most of the tokens, they could potentially have an outsized influence on how a platform or project is run.
It's like any system. You have to be mindful of who holds the power and how they might use it.
Exactly. And then there's this whole regulatory uncertainty around tokens. Governments are still trying to figure out how to classify them, how to regulate them, which can create hurdles for projects and businesses operating in the Web3 space.
Feels like a lot needs to be sorted out on that front before Web3 can truly reach its potential. But here's what really blew my mind. The authors actually explore this possibility of Web3 evolving beyond tokens.
That is a bold idea. I mean, tokens have become so central to the Web3 narrative, it's almost hard to imagine what it would even look like without them.
Right. But they discuss alternative models like reputation-based systems, which are already used in online communities, or non-fungible tokens, NFTs, which could represent ownership or access rights in new and innovative ways. It's like they're challenging us to think outside the box. Consider what a more mature, evolved version of Web3 might look like.
I love that they're not afraid to kind of push the boundaries there and ask those big questions. It feels like they're genuinely trying to explore all the possibilities, not just advocate for one particular approach.
So we've had these deep conversations about governance and the role of tokens. Let's get a bit more practical for a moment.
Yeah.
How did these Web3 systems, actually get built?
That's exactly what they cover in the chapter on Web3 architectures. They start by encouraging a shift from what they call platform thinking to network thinking, which I think is a really important distinction.
Okay, can you explain what they mean by that?
Sure, it's about moving away from that traditional model of these centralized platforms where one company controls everything and embracing a more interconnected, more collaborative approach where different components and services can interact and work together seamlessly.
So instead of building walled gardens, you're creating an open ecosystem where innovation can flourish.
Precisely. They go on to explain the core elements of Web3 architecture, including the blockchain layer, which provides that foundation for security and immutability, the smart contract layer, which allows for automation and complex logic, and then the application layer, where all those cool decentralized applications and services get built.
Sounds like a complex but incredibly powerful system.
It is. And they also talk about the importance of what they call third-party elements, like scaling solutions to handle all those transactions, blockchain oracles to bring real-world data onto the blockchain, and privacy protocols to protect, sensitive information.
So it's not just about the core blockchain technology. It's about building this entire ecosystem around it to support all these new applications and use cases.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest challenges they highlight is this need for interoperability between different blockchains and decentralized systems.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a hurdle.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be very useful if you could only use your decentralized identity or access your data on, one specific platform.
Exactly. They argue that interoperability is crucial for unlocking the full potential of Web3, creating that seamless user experience we were talking about earlier.
Okay, we've laid out a lot of the conceptual groundwork here, but I'm really curious to see how they bring all of this together into a practical roadmap.
And that's where their chapter on decentralization of traditional architectures with decentralization layers comes in. This is where their vision for a more integrated and accessible Web3 really comes to life.
Okay, remind me again. What exactly is this decentralization layer, and how does it work?
They're basically proposing adding this layer on top of existing systems, leveraging smart contracts and blockchain technology to enhance security, transparency, and efficiency.
So you don't have to scrap everything and start from scratch. You can just add this layer and get All the benefits of Web3.
Exactly. And they give specific examples of how this could be done in industries like healthcare, supply chain management, even media distribution. They even talk about things like, regulatory considerations and the economic feasibility of implementing this layer.
So they're thinking about the real-world implications, not just the tech itself.
Exactly. And they dedicate a whole chapter to industry case studies, exploring how this decentralization layer could transform sectors like gaming, media distribution, even social media.
Okay.
For instance, they talk about how decentralized gaming platforms can allow players to actually earn real-world value for their time and effort,
Oh, that's interesting.
which is a huge shift from that traditional model, right?
Yeah, it's like they're blurring the lines between work and play and giving players more ownership over their in-game assets and achievements.
Absolutely. And in the media world, they talk about how decentralized platforms can empower creators to connect directly with their audiences, retain greater control over their content and how they monetize it.
It's like cutting out the middleman and giving creators more power, more autonomy,
Mm.
which is something I think a lot of artists and musicians are really fighting for these days.
Definitely. And in the social media space, they explore how decentralized platforms can offer greater privacy, reduce censorship, and create more engaging and community-driven experiences.
It's like they're offering a vision for a more open, more democratic, more user-centric internet, which is something I think a lot of people are really longing for. It's pretty inspiring, honestly.
It is. And then in their epilogue, Decentralization as a Separate Industry, they take this vision even further. They imagine a future where decentralization itself becomes a core part of the tech landscape, with companies offering things like decentralization as a service or DaaS.
So instead of having to build everything from scratch, you could just tap into these services and get access to the tools, the infrastructure, the expertise you need to decentralize your own projects or businesses.
Exactly. And they see decentralization as more than just a set of technologies. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about and build systems, a shift that could have profound implications for society, the economy, even our individual freedoms.
Wow. They really have given us a lot to think about. From the history of disruptive tech to those practical implications of decentralization, this book really covers it all.
It really does. They've done an amazing job of, breaking down complex concepts and presenting this vision for a future where technology empowers individuals, fosters transparency and accountability, and ultimately creates a more equitable and resilient digital world.
I think that's a future worth striving for. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me. It's been really eye-opening.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, if you're intrigued by any of these ideas, I highly recommend checking out The Age of Decentralization. It's a really thought-provoking read that'll challenge your assumptions about the future of technology and the role it plays in all of our lives, like